Hello, listener. It's your host, Andy Chin. Welcome back to Business Logic for the first time in a long time. I believe it's been about a year since the last episode came out, and it's been an interesting year. For one, for myself, I started a new job at a startup called Modern Treasury. It's been great so far. I really love it. We are 20 people big and really quickly growing. So, if you're looking for a new job and you're considering the earlier stage, highly recommend giving us a look. But besides that, it's been tough to make the show because I've been working so hard at Modern Treasury to make a good first impression. So the show has kind of fallen on my priority queue. But in that absence, I've realized that I really love making this show. I love meeting people through this show. I love the occasional comment that I get DM'd saying that, hey, Andy, when's the next show? I miss it. And even though this show does not have the biggest fan base, it's not hugely viral, it means something to some people. And that is reason enough for me to try to keep at it as best I can. However, there's one thing I should say, which is that I cannot promise any sort of regularity like I used to be able to. The show used to come out on a monthly cadence, and it's just too hard for me to do that with my full-time job now. So there will be no regularity. The shows will come out whenever I feel like it, and more than that, you never know when the last show will be. For all you know, this could be the last episode of Business Logic forever. Keeps you on your toes. Makes it interesting.
I think we don't think there's sort of a silver bullet for authentication today, given where technology is. We think there's sort of ways to stitch together the best authentication flow for your application and your users. And that's why we really see ourselves as a platform. We want to provide the tools for you to build the flow that makes the most sense for your use case.
My guest today is an incredible guest. Her name is Julianna Lamb, and she is the co-founder and CTO at Stytch. That's Stytch with a Y. Stytch is a provider of user authentication infrastructure. They are just about a year old as a company, but in that time, they've been extremely productive. They have launched an email-based authentication product, which you can try right now on the website. And they also raised a seed round, which was led by no other than Chetan Puttagunta, who was a prior guest on the show. And he also joined their board, which is really cool. So this episode is a real gem, I think, because Julianna shares her wisdom when it comes to the domain of user authentication. So she talks through the history of how we got to where we are, as well as the future and what is next for authenticating humans on the internet. It's also interesting because of the unique times that we live in. She details what it's like to start a company during COVID and how you hire in an environment like this and how you create a tight team culture when everyone's on video calls. And lastly, she has a lot of incredible opinions when it comes to organization design. And she talks through kind of the best way to organize people to solve common goals. So I'm personally pretty happy with this episode, especially considering that I'm a little rusty, but I will let you be the judge of that. So without further ado, this is my conversation with Julianna Lamb. Julianna, welcome to Business Logic.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining. I thought it would be an interesting starting point to ask you a question that's really a sign of the times. And specifically, we're 10 months into this COVID-19 pandemic. And so really it's kind of this exercise of, do you remember what was the last thing that you did last year that is unthinkable today because you can't do it during the quarantine measures? What was the last thing that you remember doing before the pandemic?
So the weekend before everything really sort of shut down was the last time I was on a plane. I flew to Cabo with a dozen of my friends for someone's bachelorette party, and we went to clubs and we're hanging out with a bunch of people, and it's just something that I don't even know when I will do something like that again. It's probably still a year plus away, if not more.
I kind of few COVID no-nos in there. One is flying, being in a club. It's hard to social distance in a club. That is unthinkable. That's a good answer. When was that in 2020, roughly?
I was, I think, like March 12th, 13th. We almost didn't go on the trip because things were like sort of starting to look bad at that point, but no one had really locked down and, borders were still open, etc. And so it was definitely a bit of a decision to go, and we ended up doing it. And then I think on Sunday when we flew back, San Francisco like announced lockdown orders. And
Wow.
yeah, I haven't seen most of those people now in almost a year because they're from all over the country. And so they haven't hopped on planes either since then.
Wow. Yeah. I remember when it was kind of just this weird virus thing in the news, and it was kind of scary. I was also traveling March or April or so. And so, yeah, it went from theoretical to very real very quickly. Okay. So that was March of 2020. So let's skip ahead a few months, and now we're in June. And so we're all in lockdown, and people are coping with that in various different ways. Some people are like me, and we start a new Netflix series. Other people start baking sourdough bread. And meanwhile, you and your co-founder, Reed, decide to start a company. Why? And what exactly have you started?
Yeah, so there was definitely a period in sort of like March and April when we were starting to explore the idea and feeling like we were getting a lot of really positive feedback that it was kind of like, are we actually going to just quit our jobs in the middle of a pandemic and go start a company? Is this crazy? But I think we felt a lot of sort of pull to go and do it. And it's turned out to be a great decision. I think in some ways, COVID has been a really awesome time to start a company because there haven't been too many distractions. And so this is kind of what I've been mostly focused on. And in a lot of ways, that's been a great outlet too, to have something that I'm like really excited to be working on. So weird times, but it all sort of like came together and I think has been a great experience. To explain a little bit more about what we're working on, basically, Reed and I had both struggled with authentication problems in the past. We'd had to build auth in our roles, and we're really frustrated with sort of the vendors on the market as well as the user experience that you ended up building. We sort of had played around with some passwordless options, doing like an email or SMS one-time passcode, and could see the conversion increase as well as sort of the security benefits of doing so rather than relying solely on passwords. And so based on that experience, we are building a sort of platform for user authentication, leaning into passwordless flows and really focused on creating a better developer and end user experience.
That is awesome. And I know that certainly a lot of listeners of this show who are developers have a lot of thoughts and probably anxiety when it comes to authentication. And just the word account takeover is a trigger word. So we'll definitely talk a little bit more about the domain, because certainly I'd love to consult an expert like yourself. But before we do, maybe we could talk a bit more about the company, which is 8 employees, according to the website. When it comes to hiring, now that you're 8 employees, what exactly have you learned about hiring, especially in this unique remote-only context?
I think one of the things that maybe was a little bit amplified given the sort of remote environment when we were hiring sort of the first handful of people. They were joining basically Reed and me and couldn't meet us in person to get to know us before making the decision. And so something that we did with a lot of our really early hires is, we would do references on them, but then we'd let them do references on us as well. And we're fortunate to have as angel investors some of our former colleagues from Plaid. And so that was a really easy way to sort of, let people get to know us a little bit more and what it might be like to work with us as people. And so I think we heard really positive feedback from some of those early hires that was a great way to sort of get a sense of, what it would be like to work super closely with us.
And so looking at these 8 early employees, it looks like they're almost all exclusively engineers and designers, which I imagine is really intentional. But how are you thinking about the side of the business that's more about go-to-market?
Yeah, so we actually had our first 2 non-engineering product design hires accept offers in the past week. So
Nice.
We're sort of now starting to expand beyond that. One is a technical recruiter, so we'll be focusing on growing engineering and design. The other is sort of a biz ops generalist, and I think we'll have a couple more sort of go-to-market hires in the next couple months. We really are focused, though, on catering to developers, and with that have a lot of emphasis on sort of a self-serve sign-up flow. Can you sign up, get API keys, get up and running, hopefully in under like 30 minutes without ever talking to a human. And so that's why a lot of the initial hires are more focused on sort of the engineering and design aspects, as well as more on sort of the ops side of things, right? Of how do we sort of scale to a large customer base pretty quickly.
That makes sense. And it reminds me of a now famous Quora post by Patrick Collison when answering why is it that Stripe has no product managers. This is not true, of course, anymore, but at the time they had gotten, pretty big without hiring a single PM. And it was a similar rationale, which is like, well, we're building for developers, so it makes sense to have developers kind of be the first decision makers when it comes to version 1. Talk to me a bit about, going back to what you said earlier about hiring remotely, what tends to win candidates over when, say, like hypothetically, they're on the fence about joining Stytch? What are the magic words that you say and do to convince that candidate?
Yeah, so I think our product really helps us here because, we're working on solving a pain point that everyone is familiar with, either from a developer perspective where you've had to build auth before and that's been really frustrating, or just as an end user, you've dealt with managing all your passwords and frustrating login experiences. And so I think that resonates with a lot of people, definitely tends to resonate more with those who have seen it from the developer perspective. And I think something else that it sort of depends on the background people are coming from. If they haven't been exposed to developer infrastructure before, I think really sort of talking about the impact you can have at a platform company, because you sort of are building for developers who then are building a myriad different end products, right? And so that really just sort of multiplies the effect that you can have with the product that you're building. And I think that's something that I didn't really know about before joining Plaid. And as soon as I got there and sort of saw the scale that we were operating at and just how prevalent the product was without even you necessarily knowing about it, sort of got me really excited about continuing to play in this space. And I think that's something that I see candidates getting excited about as well.
I personally think that's a particularly cool aspect of Stytch, is that no matter who you're talking to, whether it's a developer who's had to integrate authentication or every user of the internet has gone through some authentication flow of some kind. Like it's so relatable no matter who you're talking to. So I think that's one thing that definitely works in your favor there. When it comes to company building and building the culture, what exactly have you done to keep things feeling tight and cohesive, even though everyone could be, hundreds of thousands of miles apart? At Modern Treasury, where I work, we do something really cool that I'd like to plug, which is this idea of coffee breaks. You can think of them kind of like chats where we bring in a guest over Zoom, and for 45 minutes, totally off the record, we ask them whatever we want, just a real-time AMA, and it's wonderful, and it's something to look forward to every week. So what does Team Stytch do?
So we definitely explicitly copied Modern Treasury and we do it a monthly fireside chat. We didn't quite copy the naming, and I've had some really cool guests on that. I think that's been a great way to sort of, take a step back and just sort of let people learn from each other and from the guest and explore another topic. We also are fairly intentional with sort of how we structure our day-to-day to make sure that we have enough touch points, but also knowing that remote work sort of lends itself to flexibility, right? And making sure that people can put their calendars together in a way that allows them to do their best work. And so we have a almost daily stand-up, and we usually spend a couple minutes of that, just sort of chatting, catching up. Usually there's a dog that makes an appearance and sort of getting to know each other on a more personal level. And we recently also introduced a sort of Friday lunch hour where we just, eat lunch together over Zoom, which can be a bit awkward, but it's also just a really great time to sort of chat about, what people might be planning for the weekend and just get to know each other on another level. We also do some sort of every other week, we'll do a happy hour event on Thursday afternoon. It pretty frequently is us playing Among Us together, which has actually been a really fantastic way to, just get to know more about people. I think everyone's learned that I have pretty much the worst poker face. So getting to know things like that about your coworkers is still something that you can definitely do in a remote world. I think it just requires a lot more sort of intent and structured sort of breakout times.
Among Us is super clutch, and it really came out in the ideal moment. It is so fun to play. And yeah, what is it with Zoom and eating? Like having lunch as a team in person, it's no problem. I can do it just fine. But I don't know what it is about having a meal with people over Zoom. It's just so much more awkward.
Yeah, I don't know what it is either. I think we have sort of gotten over that to some degree, especially if everyone's eating. Maybe that's part of it is normally you don't sort of have everyone eating, right? So there might be like one odd out person, frequently me, who's not had time to eat lunch and has to like cram it into a meeting. And I think that can be kind of awkward, but I found that if it's everyone, it doesn't feel quite as weird, but agreed that there is some dynamic between sort of doing that in person versus on Zoom that is a bit weird.
I'm always anxious because I have a slightly nicer microphone than most colleagues. And so I'm always anxious that I'll give everyone an accidental ASMR session just by, eating and it gets all picked up. And that's no fun. Why don't we talk a little bit more about this domain of user authentication? And it always helps to start off with some history. So I'd love for you to give us, I guess, the story of how we got here today when it comes to the problem of authenticating people over the internet.
Yeah, definitely. So this is a history about as long as the internet exists, right? The web did start with sort of just static sites. And so authentication was introduced when those static sites evolved into something more dynamic, where all of a sudden you had to have something that was customized to a specific user, right? And with that, authenticate them in order to sort of give them that personalized view. And so back then, in like the 90s, et cetera, it was really heavily reliant on a something factor, largely because that's sort of what was easiest to do with the technology that existed then. And so something is most frequently just called a password. It's a memorized secret. You don't sort of need any additional technology beyond the storing that password in your database in order to do that. But I think as online accounts became more and more widespread and prevalent, people had more accounts. They typically used similar, if not the same passwords across many of those accounts. And so you start to run into those issues with password reuse where, it's only as strong as the weakest link that you've used your password with. So random website gets hacked, right? Usernames and passwords are stolen. You reuse that password across all of your different sites, all of a sudden attackers can take over any of your online accounts. And I think that sort of coupled with some developments in technology like programmatic SMS and email, you start to really see two-factor authentication take hold, primarily because you just can't rely on a password as a sole factor, because while you and I probably use one password, and many people do, I know I still even will reuse passwords with accounts that I think are just really not high value. And, maybe I'm signing up on mobile to the, I don't know, website where I order lunch from, right? And I'm oh, this is I don't want to go through the hassle of storing this in one password. And so you see that amplified across people who, might not be already using one password because of work. And password reuse is still a really big problem. So two-factor authentication starting to really sort of take hold. And I think in a lot of cases, it can be fairly frictionless. But I think as it's gotten more prevalent, people have looked for even lower friction ways to do authentication. So you see things like Touch ID, Face ID, WebAuthn now starting to come online and be more prevalent. And I think all of those sort of new factors of authentication are really exciting in terms of the security they offer, but also a much better user experience than constantly having to fumble for a password.
So that was a kind of a brief overview, I guess, of the past and sneak peek at the future with WebAuthn and the exciting standards. I'm glad you brought up 1Password, because I wanted to ask you, I guess, what your take on password managers generally is. In some ways, I think of it at least as a crutch with the path dependency of the web so far, where, look, we got passwords everywhere, so we're going to store them all in one vault. We're going to impose kind of arbitrary length and special character requirements just to try to make them slightly harder to guess, but people still get pwned. What do you make of that tooling that essentially reinforces the status quo in passwords?
Yeah, I think you put it really well. I also see it as a crutch. It's a great crutch. It works pretty well, but it sort of doesn't address the fundamental problem here, which really is just passwords. I think there have been a lot of sort of innovations and companies trying to create a better password experience, right? And not sort of addressing that sort of underlying issue. And so I think that's what we're really excited to tackle at Stytch is not just how do you sort of create the best Band-Aid solution, but how do you actually sort of change the way that people authenticate?
Right. So for the consumers, you kind of place this superhuman burden on them to just remember all these like long strings for every website. And so you have password managers to help you there. What about for developers? What in particular is acutely painful about implementing an authentication flow today in 2021?
Yeah, so I think people are faced with a couple options. They can roll their own, build in-house. That has pretty high maintenance burden and it's ongoing, right? As new technology develops, I think you've seen a couple companies start to use WebAuthn, but very, very few. And it's probably because it's just a huge sort of development time commitment in order to add support for that. So that's sort of one of the drawbacks with building in-house. You also are then sort of having to stay on top of trends and understand, what is like the cutting edge user experience. And I think you see companies with really great and large growth teams sort of staying on that cutting edge. And I'll use Cash App as an example they have a lot of sort of passwordless flows there. But I think you see a lot of smaller companies that maybe did build in-house and they want to emulate that flow, but they aren't sure sort of what the best option is for the type of data they're protecting, their end user base, different demographics perform very differently with different authentication factors. And so that's just a huge amount of sort of time and work and research that most companies don't have time for and isn't, their core product. It's sort of something that's really important, but isn't something that they're necessarily differentiating on. And then I think on the flip side, you see people sort of buying from existing vendors. And a lot of times then you're sort of locked into whatever their concept of user authentication is. And typically it's very password heavy, very focused on what we call app-based authentication, which is, you log in once, you set your session, that's the end of your authentication journey, versus doing sort of more granular authentication flows. I think Monzo Bank is one example of this. You get read access to your account with one factor. When you go to move money or do something more sensitive, they then step you up to that second factor. I think GitHub, another example of this, you have to re-enter your password if you go to do something a little bit more sensitive, like changing an organization setting and sort of entering this quote unquote pseudo mode. So I think you see more people trying to sort of build authentication within their application in a way that makes sense for their users.
That is super interesting. I did not know that Monzo did this graduated approach where you can do certain things depending on, I guess, how authenticated you are. Prior to this, I guess I thought about it in a really binary point of view, like you're either in or out, authenticator or not. But that's really cool. Authentication is everywhere, frankly. Something that I worked on at one point was this. Have you heard of strong customer authentication?
I have.
So yeah, now the law is apparently the law is requiring for a lot of payments in Europe, card payments in particular, for the payers to authenticate themselves in some way. And basically, it kills conversion in a lot of ways, which is really scary if you're a European online merchant. And so that's kind of a frequent trade-off, I guess, people have to think about, which is you sometimes have to weigh security against the friction that it causes. Theoretically, I could go to Stytch right now, implement 3-factor authentication and a step-up PIN. And that could work, but my users would presumably drop off pretty severely. So how would you advise developers to think through that trade-off?
Yeah, I think it really does depend sort of on the type of data you're protecting and your customer base. So I think a crypto wallet, right? Users are going to be much more willing to jump through a bunch of different hoops in order to get authentication. In fact, if they aren't jumping through those hoops, they're probably going to question your app and whether it's something that they actually want to use. So in that case, more auth is often even a selling point. versus if I'm trying to log in to, say, Medium to read the news, then that probably isn't something that I'm willing to jump through many hoops to get access to. So I think developers really need to think about, sort of what they're trying to do. More authentication isn't always better. I think as we've sort of covered, I see passwords as something that you basically always have to layer a second factor onto because you just can't trust that they haven't been already breached. So that sort of reduces some friction if you remove passwords entirely, which is why we're leaning into that. And I think you had a really good example actually with SCA, which is sort of a just-in-time authentication event, right? Where I'm a user, I'm going and trying to do a payment. And so I have really strong intent to complete that action, right? And so more likely to jump through authentication hoops at that point in time than I am if I'm just like landing on an e-commerce site and want to browse and sort of maybe see some recommendations that are tailored to me, but I'm not sure I'm actually going through the checkout step at that point. So thinking about where in your flow you implement authentication, and particularly more higher friction authentication, I think is a way to sort of not make that trade-off between user experience and security and sort of capture the user at the right point in time.
Yeah, it's a great point with SCA where, I guess I hadn't considered an alternative where you didn't ask people to identify themselves at the point of payment. But if it were any earlier in the flow, that'd be just even worse. So looking at the offerings that Stytch has when it comes to passwordless options. Well, currently you have email-based authentication, but the more fun name is Magic Links. You see a preview of the roadmap too with like biometric stuff. You've got one-time passwords, time-based one-time passwords, and WebAuthn and stuff. So I sort of see a lot of options. And as a developer who is totally ignorant of all of these standards and what their various pros and cons are, could you sort of walk me through each of them?
Yeah, definitely. I think the best use case can definitely be a bit nuanced, but I think there are some sort of broad generalizations that you can pretty easily make. So for email magic links, for example, I think that tends to do better on web platforms where you're likely signed in to your email client already, probably just in another tab. It's very easy to click over to, versus SMS one-time passcodes perform much better on mobile. Part of that is autofill on iOS, makes it so that you never have to leave the app to get that passcode. And I think conversely, magic links do tend to do a little bit worse on mobile because you have to go into your email client to actually click the link and redirect back to the app. So that's one thing to keep in mind. We've also found sort of age demographics can have some sort of different success rates with those two factors in particular. We've found with older generations, email magic links tend to perform better than SMS does. And sort of our theory there, and from some of the user research we've done, is that younger generations sort of live with their phone as an extension of their hand, and it's always with them. And so they always have that. I know I will call my mom sometimes and she'll call me back like an hour later and be like, oh, I left the phone in the other room. And I just like can't imagine doing that. But I think that sort of showed up in that user research that older demographics don't always have access to their phone, or sometimes will fumble what the passcode is. My mom's husband, I was trying to help him log into his bank account, and he kept entering the phone number that the one-time passcode came from as the passcode instead of the passcode that was contained in the message. And so I think there's just more sort of like variability in how different people can sort of handle those SMS passcodes, especially when you're going to enter it on web. Then getting into sort of authenticator apps like a Google Authenticator for time-based one-time passcodes, I think those are really great for sort of power user demographics. I probably have like 24 passcodes on my Google Authenticator app, right? My mom has never heard of Google Authenticator though. So I think we see that as a really good sort of power user feature for any sort of really sensitive application. So any fintech, for example, where there's money movement involved, offering that for people who do have concerns about SIM swaps is a really great option. I think in general, SIM swaps are extremely expensive to execute. So only for really, really high value accounts where there's sort of no checks and balances in place. And I think crypto is the really great example there. I think then you should be worried about SIM swaps for sort of just basic account access. It's probably not worth it for someone to jump through those hoops to do a SIM swap to take over a random account of mine.
Earlier, I heard you mention that you were doing kind of a lot of user demographics research about kind of how your age affects what authentication method you're likely to prefer, which I think is really cool. It's also very scientific and kind of you're not trying to force people to push an agenda for a particular method. I guess that's the question really, is that true? Is Stytch there to just provide whatever the consumers want to do, or are you also pushing an agenda toward a particular standard or technology that you think is superior?
Yeah, I think we don't think there's sort of a silver bullet for authentication today, given where technology is. We think there's sort of ways to stitch together the best authentication flow for your application and your users. And that's why we really see ourselves as a platform. We want to provide the tools for you to build the flow that makes the most sense for your use case.
So naively, just to play a bit of devil's advocate, if I just didn't know anything about all these authentication methods that you've talked about, and I was a developer who thought that surely there must be the method that is perfect in every way. It scores highest on usability. The whole age demographic range can use it. It's well supported on all websites, so like support is there. Generally, like I don't know, it's hard to lose, maybe impossible to lose whatever the method is. Like I might conclude that Touch ID is like maybe the closest one. It's just super easy to use. Kind of a gruesome thought, but it's like it's not impossible, but it's hard to lose your fingerprint. And presumably, I'm not sure what to what degree Apple is taking the open source approach, but presumably you could imagine biometrics and stuff being supported on much more stuff than it is today. What do you make of that claim?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really exciting direction that things seem to be trending. I think today it's quite hard to get a unified picture of who a person is based on biometrics because you sort of have like device-based biometrics, right? So I have Touch ID on my laptop, I have Face ID on my phone, and so it's really hard to do cross-platform. That's something that we hope to enable and make easier is sort of using that as a primary authentication factor. I think today you see it used as so it's not even sort of part of the core authentication experience in most cases. It's just a replacement for like username and password on mobile with Face ID, or it's potentially a second factor that you can use on your laptop with Touch ID. And so I think there's a lot that needs to be done in order to sort of make that a really easy to use developer experience, easy to do cross-platform. I think there's still many, many devices out there that don't have support for that, right? You could imagine if I use like a PC at work that I then have to figure out how I authenticate to that versus using Face ID on my mobile device. And so I think there's a long ways to go in terms of sort of making that a universal standard. And I think Apple can go really far, right? But they're just one sort of device manufacturer out there, and it is very device tied, right? So I think you're always going to run into cross-platform issues as well as sort of, what happens if my like bag with my phone and my laptop gets stolen, right? How do I access an account then? I think what you mentioned is really interesting that like hopefully my biometrics don't change, right? And so I should be able to get access from a new device, but I don't think that flow is really well built out today.
So then let's say I backtrack and I actually, WebAuthn is the future because yes, hardware keys are super cheap. They're becoming much more well understood and user experience is great. You just tap something. Why would you not like kind of push this as the future for ideally all authentication for all Stytch developers?
Yeah, I think it's something that's really interesting, but still far off from like mass adoption, right? I think for developers, themselves today, it's a great way to do it. I have a YubiKey on my laptop, for example. And I think there's probably a world in which that becomes more standard. But at the same time, that's like one more thing to keep track of, right? And maybe that there's like easier ways to keep track of it. I think you still run into issues with like stolen keys. You then have to have a backup key, right? And leave that at home in case your primary one gets stolen. And so I think regardless of these like really great sort of happy path use cases, there's always going to need to be some sort of like recovery flow, right? Or sort of secondary factor that you can use. And so I think that's why we're really excited about this sort of like platform play, is that I hope that WebAuthn gets like really great adoption and that biometrics are sort of the primary way you authenticate into applications. Obviously, I think technology will continue to evolve and that might change too. There might be something that we haven't even thought of yet that becomes more and more prevalent. And Stytch enabling developers to sort of stay on top of those trends and always be on sort of the cutting edge of both user experience and developer experience is really what our goal is.
I find it kind of funny and ironic that now we're like 30 years into the internet and we're asking this question still of like, how do we identify people? And to some degree, our favorite solutions that so far between WebAuthn and biometrics are anti-internet, because you're not sending data over any sort of network. And so you prevent any man-in-the-middle sort of attack, which is kind of funny, but makes sense when you just appreciate how hard it is to prevent that kind of attack. So authentication is hard, as we've heard, but it's also critical. It's a necessity for any sophisticated web application. How do you win the trust of developers for them to choose Stytch for that job?
Yeah, it's a great question and something I spend a lot of time thinking about. I think there's sort of two aspects here. There's like availability and security, right? We need to make sure that our infrastructure is extremely reliable. We sit in critical paths for developers. And so that's something that we just need to get right. I think security is the same. We're sort of asking you to outsource almost some of your security to us. And so it's important that we really nail that as well. And so I think we are probably much farther ahead of most startups our age in terms of how we think about these things. We started thinking about SOC 2 before we even had anyone join the team. And we're starting our audit pretty soon. We just did some pen testing. And I think we'll continue to sort of keep security as part of the DNA of everyone on the team. We did like a security book club a couple weeks ago and read a book called The Web Hacker's Handbook, which is kind of a history book at this point, but I think lets you sort of explore some of the worst ways to do web security. And so that was like a really fun discussion to have. And I think little things like that just make sure that every engineer on the team, whenever they're writing code, whenever they're shipping code, is thinking about security implications is really important. But then also knowing that we have outside checks and balances like pen test, bug bounty, et cetera, to just make sure we're sort of covered as best we can be.
What are the worst ways to authenticate someone? Just curious.
So I think my anecdote for one of the worst sort of MFA flows I have seen in the wild is like a multi-choice question for a second factor. What is your favorite food? And having pizza as an option. That's basically not security at that point. I think another piece is making sure that you're thinking about sort of all of the different pieces of the authentication stack. So there's authentication, authorization, et cetera. Like any weak link there is going to sort of render the other one just irrelevant. And so making sure that you aren't sort of emphasizing too much on just one thing and forgetting about other aspects of it.
Did you happen to see that one tweet where someone was like, me failing a CAPTCHA for like the third time in a row? And it's like a shot from the movie Ex Machina. They're like, oh, am I even human? Should I even succeed at this test? Yeah, CAPTCHAs are hard these days. I'm like browsing LinkedIn these days and suddenly it's like, which direction is up for this horse? And it's like a trick question. I just didn't expect it, didn't see it coming. It's hard to deal with this stuff. Okay, well, let's move on a bit, I guess, from authentication to talking about your opinions when it comes to running an engineering team, which is your job as CTO at Stytch. You've apparently thought about this for a while. During your time at Very Good Security, you published some thinking when it came to organization design. And specifically, you talked about functional versus squad model, and I'll let you define those. But given those two frameworks, how have you decided to organize Stytch engineering?
So a functional model is really breaking down teams into what they work on. So you'd have like a front-end team, a back-end team, infrastructure, etc. There's sort of overlap on those teams in terms of the products that they work on, but you're organized around like the functional job that you do. The squad model is one that I think Spotify really popularized and is much more focused around the products that teams work on. So you'll end up with sort of a full stack team that's focused on one product area. And I think there's a lot of pros and cons to both, and sort of different times in a company's life cycle too that different teams make sense. At Stytch so far, we kind of have a hybrid approach. And I think that's part of just how our sort of product is broken down, that it makes sense right now. Also, given that a lot of our like quote unquote teams are people. So as we add more people, there will be sort of teams that form around some of these product areas. Right now, we sort of think about the team in sort of 4 different sections. So we have a like front-end full-stack team that works on sort of the developer experience, which is things like our docs, our dashboard, etc. How does a developer interact with our product? And then we have a consumer experience team that's more oriented around the end user experience. So they build our SDKs for web and mobile. And then we have sort of a back-end team that works on some of the core back-end services that sort of support those. And then the API itself. Mm-hmm. And then we have platform engineering, which owns infrastructure, but does sort of jump in across the stack in order to sort of build some of the features that maybe are sort of crossing the line between what's infrastructure and what's backend, et cetera.
And so each of these disciplines you just mentioned is more or less one person today, which is really impressive. It's I guess it's a good range of people that you have. As an API company or a developer-focused company, there are a lot of pieces that you just mentioned between the API, the SDKs, client libraries, like just things that generally make Stytch really nice and easy to integrate with. How would you think about prioritizing among all of those?
Yeah, so we definitely think of a lot of the sort of developer experience pieces as first-class products. The 2 first teams and products I mentioned, right, were just focused on developer experience and making it really easy to build these flows, whether that be via the dashboard with our integration guides, API docs, all of that, as well as our SDKs, and making sure that those are a great sort of out-of-the-box end user experience, as well as very easy for a developer to drop in. We also have invested a lot of time in building client libraries, example applications, etc. It's why we've had a really sort of extended beta period. It's been focused on really getting feedback on what it's like to integrate with our product so that when we launch self-serve, it truly is self-serve and you can figure out what you need to in order to get up and running really smoothly. And I think as sort of developers building for developers, that is one of the best areas for product feedback, right? And so we sort of have had everyone on the team, regardless of where they jump in, work on client libraries, build example apps, and sort of test out the product.
That's awesome. Really big fan of the eating your own dog food philosophy, especially when it comes to developer products. It's something that actually would be really relevant for me. I work at Modern Treasury, and that's also a fairly small engineering team. I think we're 7 or 8 full-timers now. And something that we've just kind of started putting into practice is performance reviews, which is kind of a weird thing to think about for baby companies like Modern Treasury and Stytch. What's worked well there? How do you keep people motivated and productive and maybe not get too distracted in what your role is or comp and stuff like that?
Yeah, definitely. I think we've kind of been in what I would describe as a little bit of a honeymoon phase because the first engineers joined us sort of early fall last year, right? And we have gone from basically having a like very janky API that ran on my laptop to like having real customers live in production. And so much has changed in that amount of time that I think we also sort of looked for people to join the team that were really excited about what we were building to sort of help play a role in defining what that is. And so I think we've been through this phase of like very much 0 to 1, everyone sort of figuring things out for the first time. Everything pretty much is net new that people are working on. And so I think it's much easier for people to stay excited when it's sort of that phase. But like as you grow, as projects become more siloed, smaller, etc., I think having a really good sort of pulse check on, how people are doing, are they excited about what they're working on, where do they want to grow, all of that is super important. And so one of the things I've been spending some time on recently is setting up our first sort of lightweight performance review cycle. So we will basically do it when most of the team has been here 6 months, which I think is probably really early for most companies. But I think building that muscle and making sure that we don't sort of end up in a situation in a year from now, right, where people feel like they aren't being as challenged as they were in the early days is really worth the time and investment up front to get that right.
Have you gone as far as to define levels for each of these roles, like a lot of, I guess, the more mature companies do?
We haven't done that yet. I have been thinking that it's probably something we do when we go through the sort of like annual review cycle in the fall. And I really value levels because I think it helps to motivate people for them to have a clear picture of like where they are today and what they need to work on. Because I think otherwise you can end up in a scenario where eventually you're going to introduce levels, right? And someone is going to be frustrated because they didn't realize that there was some skill that they should have been developing to be at the next level. And so I think being as transparent as possible is like the best thing that you can do for people so that nothing catches anybody by surprise. People feel like, they know where they're headed and they know like what sort of growth looks like. I know that's something that like I found frustrating as an engineer sometimes is like not knowing, how do I like get better at this, right? I think it's sort of innately a human trait to want to improve. And so I see levels as just sort of a means to providing a framework for that. And so I would imagine similar to how we're like introducing performance reviews sort of earlier than a lot of companies that we also introduce levels. And I think the other benefit there is sort of fairness as well and transparency, right? It helps you sort of gut check and make sure that you aren't letting maybe bias seep in. Maybe one engineer is just really great at negotiating their initial offer, right? And so they end up just way out of band on salary and just making sure that our team too feels like they're valued and that they're being compensated fairly and don't have to sort of, go and look elsewhere to get a more compelling offer. We want them to be excited about working at Stytch for the long run, not just because they're working on exciting things, but also because they're being treated fairly and like humans.
Kudos to you all for being so proactive about this. Yeah, I personally don't think it's at all too early to start thinking about this, and it really inspires confidence, I think, in leadership when you are being thoughtful about this in particular. Something else that I've noticed that you've been thoughtful on is code reviews, because I noticed you had a blog post from your Plaid days about what you think makes a great code review. So maybe you could talk us through the common pitfalls as well as what you consider to be best practice.
Yeah, definitely. I think code reviews are a really important piece of engineering culture and personal development. It's sort of like the one constant touch point you have for feedback, right? And I think looking at code reviews as a learning experience for both the requester and the reviewer in any given pull request is sort of the best way to make sure that you have like thoughtful and productive code reviews. I think there's definitely some sort of, specific things that you can do to help keep that sort of mindset. I think one example of that is being really thorough in terms of responding to comments, not sort of leaving any stone unturned, right, and just ignoring someone's comment, even if you fixed it. I know I find that frustrating when I'm reviewing things. If I've left a comment on something and maybe somebody went and fixed it, but it like wasn't quite captured in the diff, for example, then I have to go and I have to look and I have to be like, okay, did you actually do this? Did you like do it exactly as I was suggesting? Or did you like have some spin on it, etc.? And so one thing I encourage is to respond to every comment with like a commit hash if you fixed it, or a explanation of maybe why you won't do something. If you're punting it to a future PR, linking it to a linear ticket and sort of saying, won't do it in this one, it's like scope creep, but here's a ticket for when I'll address it. So generally, I think being thoughtful about how you sort of approach code reviews. We have code review guidelines that we sort of brainstormed during a retro. I had worked on writing these when I was at Plaid, and that's sort of what the blog post came out of. I think making sure you're on the same page is also really critical, right? If people have different expectations for how to do a review, timeline for when they should expect comments back, all of that can lead to sort of unnecessary frustration that I think gets amplified in remote work, right? Because you aren't sitting next to the person reviewing your code, and like if you need something really quickly, you can't just tap them on the shoulder. So I think just sort of going in, being aligned on what you can expect is a really great way to keep that process really collaborative.
I really like what you said about kind of responding to every comment. That's also like a personal preference of mine. And I'm glad to see GitHub generally offering more features related to that. Now you can, React G, thumbs up, particular comments. You can, I think there's a resolve concept now, which, it's good. But I agree the very best is when someone actually responds and says like, thanks for this, and here's how I did it. Let's look a little bit to the future, and specifically at your role as CTO, and how do you predict that your job will change over time as Stytch gets larger and more successful?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and something I've been spending time thinking about as we start to sort of make plans for how we really grow the engineering team in the next year or so. Where there's 5 engineers today, a 6th one joining next month. And so pretty rapidly, I think getting to a scale where I, as a people manager for everyone, just doesn't have the time to sort of put in the amount of like work that I would want to on that spectrum. So starting to think about how we introduce engineering management, how we evolve the org, et cetera. And then, what role do I play in all of that? I think you can probably tell that I really geek out on org design, sort of people development, all of that. That's really important to me, and something that I think I'll continue to spend a lot of my time on. And I think it's one of the best ways that I can spend my time, because ensuring that everyone is feeling challenged, productive, happy about what they're doing is just so important in terms of building our team, but also our product, right? You want people to be sort of like also out there reaching for sort of new ideas, new things to work on that can drive the company forward. And so making sure that people feel empowered is just so important. And I think the other piece that I really enjoy is sort of some of the like product and architecture discussions, thinking about how we not only build the foundation for the team, but also for the product for the long run. Is really exciting to me as well. And I think it's right now a very collaborative discussion between sort of Reed, myself, and the team, and I hope we stay that way. I think you mentioned this at one point that, Stripe didn't have product managers for a really long time because engineers are sort of some of the best PMs for an engineering-focused product, right? And so I think that's something that we'll have to see how that evolves, but it's a trait we look for in engineers is people with a little bit of a product mindset that are excited to figure out what to build, not just how to build it. So I think there's a lot of things changing as the company grows, as the org scales, and a lot to still be sort of proven out, but I've loved the role so far, and I'm excited to see how it adapts in the future.
That's a really inspiring note. And I feel like we could go on and on a bit about organization design and kind of what's next, but we're at a particular point in time in the show, and that point in time is the lightning round. So pretty straightforward. I'll just ask a question and try to answer it as concisely as possible. But If you're ready, we can just go ahead and get started.
Let's do it.
So, you're a triathlete. What is your favorite leg of the triathlon?
Absolutely running. I could run all day, every day, and be very happy.
Was that your introduction to the sport, or were you a swimmer originally?
So I was actually a figure skater growing up.
Oh, interesting.
That was basically my life until I went to college. And I quit when I went to college, and I picked up running just for fun to stay healthy and fit. I think you go from training, 2 to 4 hours every single day all year long to all of a sudden not having a sport. And I needed something to fill that void. And so I started running, really enjoyed it, and sort of spent most of college just running for fun, did some half marathons, etc. And it's kind of like, I want a new challenge. I want something that I feel like I can sort of be competitive about too. I think I was never going to be the fastest runner, and I'm definitely not the fastest triathlete, but I think a little bit more competitive there just in terms of how they do age group competitions. And so there was a team at school. I joined it my senior year, and I learned how to swim. I learned how to really bike. I had biked a decent amount growing up, but just around town to school and stuff. And I think I did my first half Ironman probably 9 months into learning how to do all of this.
Congrats. About
a year later, my first Ironman, and yeah, I got hooked. I love it. I think it's also a really great way to meet people and stay in touch with people. A lot of my closest friends are bike friends that, will go out and ride 4 or 5 hours with them on a weekend.
Props to you for picking up swimming. I think that's probably the hardest leg if you weren't one of those childhood swimmers. Okay, next question. What is your preferred background music to code to, if any?
I definitely do like listening to music when I code. I think I'm not a big music person, so I usually find some sort of Spotify playlist. It's usually something a bit upbeat. I've been into one recently called Mood Booster, which is a really terrible name, and I swear it's just trending songs from TikTok, so that'll give you a sense for my music taste, but something that's, a little bit upbeat, probably a bit repetitive too, so that I can kind of tune it out and just get in the zone.
Actually that's really relevant for the next question, which is TikTok or Clubhouse?
I have a really bad TikTok addiction. I don't watch much TV. TikTok, it gets me. I downloaded it when I was stuck last Christmas flying back in a snowstorm. I had to spend the night somewhere, and I was like, what am I going to do? I'll just download TikTok.
Dangerous.
Over a year later, I really enjoyed Clubhouse before I started Stytch. And I think after starting Stytch, I spend all day on Zoom calls and have very little free time. And so Clubhouse just doesn't quite have a place in my life the same way mindlessly scrolling TikTok does.
Got it. Yeah, confession, I actually have not downloaded either myself. But I don't know. I feel like you hear and see enough of that stuff on Twitter. So I'll just wait for whatever bubbles up to that. Okay, last one. If you had to rank these vices for yourself, how would you rank them? And they are power, money, and fame.
I think that's the order I'd put them in. I think power, money, then fame. And I think it really just comes down to wanting to have an impact in the world and make a difference. And I think hopefully be someone that people can look up to. And so I think that's why I'd pick power. And I think the others are sort of secondary to that. I think having influence and getting to be a role model is probably what drives me the most.
That's really great. For those who want to learn more about you, learn more about Stytch, where should they go?
So stytch.com to learn more about Stytch. There's bios on me and the rest of the team, as well as links to Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. I also really love Twitter. So go ahead and follow me there at Julianna Lamb. I was dumb and didn't get the @Julianna handle back in 2009 when I joined Twitter, and @Julianna joined after me. So that was dumb. I learned I'm @Julianna on Clubhouse though. So That's my tie to Clubhouse. It's the first social channel I got my first name on.
Julianna, this was wonderful. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
That was indeed a really fun one. Thank you again to Julianna for being on the show. And if you like what you heard, then please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcasts app that you happen to be using. And likewise, tell all of your friends about Business Logic whenever you can. If you're on Twitter, you can also follow us at Business Logic FM, where you can get updates on the show as well as sneak previews of future guests. That about does it this time around. I will see you at the next one.